In this presentation, I'm going to discuss the several invasions that affected the language of English over the period. Here, I focus on the Old English and with reference to its inner history. As I told earlier, that there is a difference between the inner history and the outer history. When we talk about the outer history, it talks about the several historical and cultural and political factors that were instrumental in impacting the language and its status in England. When we talk about the inner history, it's more about those aspects of language that underwent significant changes over the period. So, what were those responsible factors that could change the language so efficiently and so significantly? So, that's what we are going to discuss in terms of inner history of Old English. We know that there were several invasions coming from the Celtics to the Romans to the Germanic tribes to the Anglo-Saxon, and finally culminating into the Norman conquest in 1066. So there were a lot of inner aspects of English, particularly the pronunciation, spelling, the morphemes, and the syntax. They all underwent significant changes. So, what things can be attributed in making these changes over the period? That's what we are going to discuss now. So, when we talk about the historical division of English, we know that it has a significant aspect of the inner history because the English has been divided here in the three historical periods. The first one, which we name as Old English, the period of full inflections. The Middle English, which was there from 1150 to 1500, was considered as a period of level inflections. Remember, this was the time when Chaucer had started writing his prologue and many other important works in English. And then modern English, we can say it started since 1500. That was the time when, of course, Chaucer bridging the gap in this case. It was considered as a period of lost inflections. So, in terms of inner history, this division becomes very important to see how the Old English, which was full of inflections, toward the end of this coming to the modern English period, it almost lost the inflections part, and it was called as the period of lost inflections. Um, so when we talk about the inner history of Old English, it is important to note the different dialects which were in existence at that time. The four dialects which were in existence at this point of time were Northumbrian and Mercian, which were actually called as the Anglian kind of dialect. Um, the Kentish was the dialects of the Jutes in the southeast. Um, Northumbrian and Mercian were the dialects um, of the north of Thames, settled by the Angles, and therefore they were called Anglian. Um, on the other hand, we say about Kentish, of course, it was like the dialect of the Jutes. Um, what was important here was West Saxon, which was the dialect of the West Saxon kingdom in the southwest. This was the language. This was the dialect that attained the position of a literary standard. So that means most of the literature that was produced in this period was written in West Saxon. So whatever record we have available with us today, that record is in the West Saxon because of the preservance of literature of the Old English, which was written in this particular dialect called West Saxon dialect. So when we start with the few characteristics of Old English, let's begin with the pronunciation part. And the first thing that was quite significant in terms of pronunciation, apart from the fact that it was like there were a lot of things um, like English showed the shifting of certain consonants described above in under the head of Grimm's law. They were there, and there were like weak and strong declarations also in terms of the adjective and the different conjunctions. They were like common features which Old English moved from the Anglo-Saxon to the Germanic language earlier. But a few changes we could see here in terms of the pronunciation that demarcates the Old English from the present day English. So the first thing that we could see was the long vowels underwent a significant change in this particular period. So we can have these examples here. We can see that the stone became stone, holly became holly, gone became go, foot became foot. So that kind of the long vowels underwent change. We have many other examples here, which we can see that how these differences could be seen in terms of pronunciation. If we see that the C letter that was responsible or that was instrumental for the pronunciation of k sound, so we generally use we said keen, which was represented by C letter. Similarly, there were other. These words show that there were a lot of significant change in terms of the pronunciation. Second important aspect of the Old English was its spellings. One most important aspect of the spelling was Old English made use of the two characters. Like in our present system, we may call it per and the to represent, but in that period, these two characters represented the sound of th, as in with or when. So you see that these two characters are no more into vogue in our present day English because they were different characters which were giving different kind of pronunciation. So like with and when were the two kind of sounds that were represented by the character mentioned here. Another thing which was important in terms of spelling was that Old English expressed the sound of a in hat by digraph as in ash. So this digraph was very much in vogue during the Old English period. The third important aspect was different spellings used for the different sound production. You can see here, like SC was like sh, which we see in the present English. It is replaced by sh, sh. C was, as I discussed in the previous slide also, C represented k. So this C is in keen and naked. We see that in the Old English, C character was generally used for the k sound, and the fricative ch, which we find in our present day English, was earlier in the Old English represented by again C sound. So as we see in bench in the Old English spelling BENC, which is bench, and in the present English it is called CH, bench. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss the several invasions that affected the language of English over the period. Here I'm focused on the Old English and with reference to its inner history. As I told earlier that there is a difference between the inner history and the outer history. when we talk about the outer history, it talks about the several historical and cultural and political factors that were instrumental in impacting the language and its status in England. When we talk about the inner history, it's more about those aspects of language that underwent significant changes over the period. So, what were those responsible factors that could change the language so efficiently and so significantly? So, that's what we are going to discuss in terms of inner history of Old English. We know that there were several invasions coming from the Celtics to the Romans to the Germanic tribes to the Anglo-Saxon, and finally culminating into the Norman conquest in 1066. So there were a lot of inner aspects of English, particularly the pronunciation, spelling, the morphemes, and the syntax. They all underwent significant changes. So, what things can be attributed in making these changes over the period? That's what we are going to discuss now. As far as grammar is concerned of the Old English, we can talk about the inflectional languages that could fall in the two categories of the two classes. One was synthetic and the other analytic. Um, Synthetic language was a category of that kind of language which indicates the relation of words in a sentence by means of inflections. So, for example, here we have this example: Nero interfacit Agrippinam and Agrippinam interfacit Nero. So we can see here that in this particular two sentences, where we talk about Nero interfacit Agrippinam and Agrippinam interfacit Nero, there was no such dependence on the word order in this case. So, for example, if we say that Nero interfacit Agrippinam or Agrippinam interfacit Nero, the meaning of the sentence remained the same. And the reason was the following: Nero in this case was a nominative case, and the am in this Agrippinum suggests the accusative case. So in that case, no matter where these words stand, the meaning remained the same, and therefore the Old English is generally considered to be a synthetic language in terms of its relationship of words in a sentence by means of inflections. On the other hand, we have the another distinction, which is what we call analytic language. And analytic language makes extensive use of prepositions and auxiliary verbs and depend upon word order to show other relationships. So here, what is more important is the word order. And we can see in the examples also, like Nero killed Agrippina and Agrippina killed Nero. These two are distinct sentences with two absolutely different meanings. That suggests that the modern English was more analytic in terms of its kind of language, and the Old English was synthetic in its kind of language. Modern English very much depends on a syntax, where the word order is very important, while synthetic, which was the characteristic of the Old English, was more in terms of dependent on the inflections in a sentence, and that's how this grammar was very different from our present day kind of English. And more things we will discuss in the next presentation. Thank you.